Welcome, everyone. My name is Geneviève Zubrzitsky. I'm director of the Center for European Studies. I'm very pleased to have you here with us this afternoon for our last event of the 2017-18 academic year. Yes, it is almost over. We opened the year with our annual distinguished lecture on Europe, which was given by Jan Werner Müller, on current populisms and in Europe and beyond, and we're closing the year with a retrospective look at 1968 protest movements in France, Germany, and Czechoslovakia half a century later. We were very happy to work a mini program around 1968. So we worked with the Michigan Theater to screen 3 films on Sunday and Monday, with 68 as an actor, an anchor, or in the background for powerful fictional stories. And today we have 3 scholars who will tell us about the events of 68, how they're remembered now, take stock of the achievements and the limits of those movements. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to remind everyone and encourage you to stay for our reception afterwards. And also to invite you to join us for the Weiser Hall inauguration lecture by Anne-Marie Slaughter next Wednesday, Tuesday on the 17th. So now to our speakers. So we have 2 sitting on the podium, a 3rd one hiding in the audience. That's for the effect, the surprise effect. So we will start here with Joshua Cole, who's professor of history here at the University of Michigan, where he teaches courses on France, the French Empire, and European history more broadly. He's currently finishing a book about a moment of anti-Jewish violence in French Algeria, entitled Empire of Fear, A Story of Provocation and Violence in French Algeria, 1934. And he will be speaking of May 68 in France. Professor Jindra Toman trained in Czechoslovakia, Germany, and the US. His academic path defined by languages and cultures of Central Europe. In the 1980s and 1990s, he focused on generative linguistics with special emphasis on Czech and German, as well on the history of linguistics more broadly. His recent research focuses on cultural history, visual culture, as well as Jewish culture in Bohemia. Last but not least, Professor Johannes von Moltke. Do you want to stand up so we can see you? Is the chair of the German department. His research and teaching focus on film and German cultural history of the 20th and 21st centuries. He's the award-winning author of several books, including The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America, published in 2015, which was a choice outstanding academic title, and No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema, published in 2005. Professor von Moltke has served as the organizer of the biannual German Film Institute, which devoted its 2008 meeting to films of 1968. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and we will start with Josh Cole.
Whoops. Oh, how do I make it come back? How do I make it advance? You know what I'm doing?
You need to go maybe here first.
No, he's got to do it back there. Oh. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button and I just reset it. Okay. Which one do I press to advance it? Must be that one on top. Sorry. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Geneviève, for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be able to give this talk about Paris in May. I'm a historian. The title is 50 Years Later, but I'm going to talk a lot about the event at the time to try and set up some understanding. And I'll just pose some questions at the end about the meaning of these events for the present. Oh, no, I still don't know which button I have to push. The one, is it?
Try.
Is it that one? No. That's backward. Which one do I press to go forward?
It should just be this one right here.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so Kristen Ross, who's a terrific historian of 20th century France, wrote that May 68 was the largest mass movement in French history, the only general insurrection the overdeveloped world has known since World War II. It was an extraordinary moment. What I'm going to try and do is just explain some of its origins for you today. I'm going to just talk about 4 major themes. First of all, I'm going to suggest that May 68 was the result of a certain kind of unease about the economic changes that France had undergone since the Second World War. That is, prosperity during the years of rebuilding, but with persistent social inequalities that people faced. I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of the Cold War, and in particular about decolonization, which had created divisions in France that were already present before the student unrest began. I'm going to focus in particular on a crisis in higher education, because it's with students that the story of May 68 ultimately begins. And I'm going to show how that crisis led people to encounter the rigidity of the Gaullist state in ways that exacerbated the social conflict, the violence of it. And there we have President Charles de Gaulle, who had come back to power during the Algerian War in 1958. Here he is in his military uniform. You know, his nickname at the military academy when he was a young man was Le Grand Asperge, the great asparagus, because he was so tall and he stood up in front of everybody else. All right. So the thing that's really striking about 68 is that this is not a political or social crisis that emerges from deprivation. This occurred at the end of 3 decades of unprecedented economic growth. Economic growth that was ultimately just coming to an end at this period. But people didn't know it yet. And what I want to suggest is that behind the unrest that breaks out in France in the late 1960s was a movement among post-war intellectuals that had been going on for some time to critique the underlying consequences of the prosperity that the French economy had undergone as a whole. And in particular, it was a critique of consumer society, that consumption had been promised as a kind of freedom to post-war generations, and yet people looked at the choices that were offered to consumers in the market society and found in them an inauthentic life, a set of choices determined by the market where they could adopt persona. And Charles Sauerwein sums it up very nicely, this view: objects replaced experience, buying replaced living, spectacle replaced reality, and looking at pictures of beautiful people replaced enjoying life itself. This is a Vespa ad from the mid-1960s. So the context is prosperity, but prosperity which is unequally shared. The education crisis, in some sense, accompanied this economic growth. If you just look at these figures here, excuse me, I'm a little thirsty. The number of students entering into the French university system in the post-war decades tripled in the space of a generation. University enrollment, which had been limited to elite students from the lycée, more than tripled during the same years. The education budget doubles, but most of the money went to building these kind of faceless, modern, ugly campuses on the periphery of French cities. This here is the University at Nanterre, which is directly northwest of Paris, which was built on the site of a shanty town that had been constructed in the 1940s and 50s by Algerian laborers and their families. Students resented these institutions. They resented the bureaucratic management of them. And it's important to remember that French universities in this period were not self-governing. They were essentially sectors that were run from the top by the Ministry of Education, which meant that when there was unrest or disagreement on any particular campus, the local dean had no authority to negotiate with students separately, right? So students resented, this is true also in many American universities, they resented the overcrowded lecture halls, they resented the bureaucracy of the educational ministry, They resented dormitories segregated by sex. And they didn't have to look far to see the inequalities that persisted in France in the post-war period. This is the shantytown in 1968. The background is public housing units that are going up, and right adjacent to this was the University at Nanterre, which is where the student unrest begins. They could look out and they could see this right from the doors of their classrooms. Now, this shantytown was not ultimately dismantled until the early 1970s. Now, the other thing that the students knew when they looked at this kind of striking image was that these very populations had themselves been discriminated against and had been the object of police violence during the French-Algerian War. As recently as October of 1961, the police had killed many dozens of Algerian protesters in Paris. This is a picture from that day. There's a wide dispute about the number of people killed that night. The high figure is probably accurate if you include all the Algerians killed in Paris during a period of several months in the spring, summer, and fall of 1961. February 1962, 10 demonstrators were also killed protesting against right-wing violence by the Parisian police. And this is important to remember because the first confrontations in 1968 were between students and these very same police. Many of the students had themselves been mobilized to political action as young students in the high schools and lycées in the region. And when they began to organize on the campus at Nanterre, they encountered the resistance of the administration who, incapable of negotiating, called in the police to put down the initial protests. You have to remember this moment. So November 1967, when the sociology students at Nanterre University first go on strike, that's 1 month after 500,000 people demonstrated against the Vietnam War in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, right? January 1968 is the beginning of the Prague Spring. January 1968 is also the beginning of the Tet Offensive, when the North Vietnamese armies quickly made it readily apparent that there was no quick victory for the United States to be had in Vietnam. So all this is happening simultaneously. In many ways, it's a conflict initially about conditions on the campus, but it's also an echo of things that are happening elsewhere in the world. The police first used tear gas against the students in late January of '68. By mid-March, radical students groups had targeted American offices in Paris. 2 banks and TWA's office were bombed. And by March 22nd, the Nanterre campus was occupied by its students and academic work ground to a halt. By the 2nd of May, Nanterre was closed indefinitely at that point. So the extraordinary explosion begins there. Not at the Sorbonne, which is a more elite institution. It begins at Nanterre, but the students at the Sorbonne had been organizing. On the 2nd of May, a right-wing student group with kind of neo-fascist overtones called Occident had raided student offices at the Sorbonne for their organizing committee. And the students were outraged, and they invited the Nanterre students to come to the center of Paris, which created the circumstances for the first confrontations with the police in the center of the city before the larger population of people who were now witnessing this in front of their doors in apartment buildings for the first time. And if you see the escalation from the 3rd of May to the 13th of May, how many people we're talking about here? By the 13th of May, 800,000 people are marching in Paris. This is at the end of 2 weeks of near constant fighting in the streets between students, skirmishing with the police, hiding in the apartments, coming back out onto the streets. And it's at that point that the Communist Party and the trade unions begin to stage sympathy strikes by mid-May. Factory occupations begin on the 14th of May, and this is the moment in which a student movement has become general. The alliance between students and workers was never fully formed, but it was simultaneous by the end of May. We don't really know how many people were on strike in the last 2 weeks of May. Some people say as many as 10 million. It's probably somewhere between 7 and 10 million. And it is by this point now in many parts of France, not just in the region of Paris. So I'll just say a few things. I want to make sure I don't take up too much time. People who lived through this moment at the end, these weeks at the end of May of 1968, talk about a kind of sense, a feeling of time being suspended. The normal routines of daily life ceased to function because the strikes. There were no more food delivered to the grocery stores. There was no more gasoline delivered to gas stations. The infrastructure of daily life had fallen apart. And in the midst was a kind of improvised, multipolar center of discussion. There were, by the third week in May, there were 500 places where you could go 24 hours a day for an ongoing political discussion and debate. All these so-called tribunes libres, these free tribunes where people would gather and debate strategies, the confrontation with the police, the confrontation with the government, the different committees, coordination, labor, information, security, press, interior gestion, that's a very peculiar word, management, right, yeah. First aid for people who are getting beat up by the police. So I want to just sort of sum up this, that what was going on was in many ways a kind of critique of a modernity which had up to that point been largely celebrated in European history. The celebration of capitalist development itself, right? Industrial society is going to produce prosperity, better lives for people. A critique of political emancipation under older models of Republican governance, right? The idea that getting the vote was enough to end oppression. That was clearly not enough for the people who were protesting in May of '68. Instead, they posited a different model of revolutionary struggle in which the forms of oppression that they were struggling against were not found necessarily just at the workplace or by political institutions, but were in fact a part of the very language that people spoke amongst themselves. They were the forms of oppression that discriminated against people were part of the kind of practices of daily life, the habits of being, as I put it there, certain concepts like the normal, the healthy, the efficient, the productive had been put in place, which were somehow standing in the way of a true human emancipation. And their struggle was as much with themselves and the forms of sociability that they lived within as it was with existing political institutions. Right? Some form of transformation of society and culture was necessary given this critique. I just want to point out that this owed a lot to intellectual movements that largely predated May '68. And I'm just going to talk about one because I think that Simone de Beauvoir's work on sex and gender is in many ways some of the more long-lasting signs for this. Simone de Beauvoir had written The Second Sex in 1949, influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy of existentialism. And she had essentially developed a theory that we now think of as the sort of social construction of gender, that our conceptions of gendered identity are produced through living in society, and that one must become aware of the ways in which society imposes its conceptions of normality. It imposes its conceptions of the obligations that are attendant upon sex, upon masculinity, and upon femininity. So this was part and parcel of a vision that saw oppression as systemic, right? And this is the move which creates the kind of confusion about '68. It was a revolution against almost everything, right? Precisely because the system was what was producing the unfreedom that people felt oppressed by. So I don't have time. I only have 50 seconds left, apparently. Okay, I can go for a few more minutes, just a couple more minutes. I don't have time to tell you how this ended. I can do this in this question and answer. Ultimately, the potential for an alliance between students protesting the government and labor unions protesting the rigidity of the Gaullist regime falls apart. Charles de Gaulle reasserts himself in Paris, essentially he gives a speech on the 30th of May, effectively saying that if you want a change of regime in France, you have to have a civil war with me. It's essentially and as a result of that speech, there was a massive counter-demonstration in Paris, smaller than the 13th of May, in which 800,000 people marched. But nevertheless, 300,000 or 400,000 people marched in favor of de Gaulle's government at the end of this revolutionary month. If you take stock about what people were after at this point, it's pretty clear that this social protest movement had at least three primary targets: Gaullism, the political ideology of the centralized state under President de Gaulle. He had written the Constitution himself in 1958. It was a protest against the United States' influence in Western Europe during the Cold War, the United States' foreign policy in Vietnam in particular. And it was a protest against the consumer society produced by capitalism itself. And of course, none of those three targets were defeated in May 1968. And there's been a huge debate about the legacy and influence of these weeks in France ever since. In many ways, the political divisions of the last couple generations were largely forged, or at least through a split that took place here. This past presidential election in France is the first one in which a presidential candidate won who was not a representative of one of the two sides in May 1968. And every 10 years, there's a kind of celebration. And there's a way in which the memory of this protest has been depoliticized. It's remembered more, I think, often in the press, in a kind of popular memory, as a kind of youthful carnival, and not as something that had a kind of real political import. I'd suggest, though, that there are real legacies. I think that there are legacies in political movements that are operating in this country today. In particular, movements that take as their point of departure a notion of systemic, and I put that in quotes, of systemic injustices or discriminations that structure our daily life. So ACT UP and gay rights groups following the AIDS crisis, in particular in the 1980s and continuing to the present. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement more recently, in which forms of oppression on racial or in terms of sexual identities are defended, articulated, debated in light of notions of the normal, which are seen as, again, kind of preventing the possibility of true emancipation for all individuals in society. One more slide I think I have here. More recently, there have been a lot of criticisms about the legacy of May 68. Michael Seidman wrote a book called The Imaginary Revolution, in which he basically argues that May 68 was a failure and it just proved the power of capitalism and the centralized states. There's also this danger in a systemic analysis of political oppressions. If oppression is truly systemic, the most extreme reading of that would be one in which there are no people who are innocent. We all are participating in it through our participation in social life in general. That is, of course, the argument of the anarchists who threw bombs in the 1890s. It's the argument of terrorism itself, that injustice is systemic and that is in its most extreme readings. I'm not saying that Black Lives Matter and Me Too movement are terrorists, but I am saying that that is the danger in this kind of the most extreme version of that. Did May 68 change our understanding of what revolution was for? This is the argument of Julien Bourg, who wrote a book arguing that May 68 was the last social revolution, the last revolution made in the name of society, and that what has been left is instead a notion of political emancipation devoted to individual human rights, the dignity of the individual. This is what's guaranteed by the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and that by removing that social content, the post-68 notions of revolutionary change have lost their traction. That's Julien Bourg. And that's all I'm going to say. Thank you. Sorry.
Our next speaker is Yendra Toman.
Thank you very much for the invitation and right. It came a little bit as a surprise to me, but I think I can share some ideas with you nonetheless. I'm not a historian, so I will not give a historical account. Actually, I would have to study a lot in order to understand many things that happened at that time. And that's not an enviable situation. I am more of a witness, I think, because I was there. And but being a witness is not easy either. It's witnessing is very complicated. My family left in '68. They went to Canada. My father was invited to some social event, some party, and he didn't know that in such parties you don't talk about politics, and you talk about whether this whiskey is good or whether you play golf or something like that. And so he said, well, we left Czechoslovakia because it was a police state. And a gentleman turned around and said, one man's opinion. And my father kind of got surprised. He had reasons for thinking that this was a police state, but it was one man's opinion. So witnessing, being a witness, is actually a kind of a risky, complicated event. I think, still, if I may, there is some American film, I think, and the main point of the film, and you know it all, I forgot it, is that the witness could not see the murder because at that time the subway train passed in front of these windows and was there for 12 seconds, and that just conflicted with the facts or something like that. So being a witness, in many cases, the point of being a witness is to defend oneself, or even to kind of even think that you might be inventing or something like that. Well, at any rate, I will be a witness. I came. I began at the Charles University in 1962. And that was a beginning of what the German comrades then later called the Schleichende Revolution, Kontrarevolution, the quietly marching counter-revolution. At that time, and you must understand that this whole period of the Cold War, which is for me a journalistic expression of no historical significance, has many segments, and in Czechoslovakia at least 5 or 6 kind of stages or layers. And this time I came to the university, and very quickly I realized that this was an open space, basically. This was a great surprise. So foreign students, Western students, groups of American students would come and have discussions with us. West German students would come have discussions with us, talking about Simone de Beauvoir. Yes, they came, Sartre, and they gave speeches in the Grand Auditorium. So the space was kind of turning into something like an extraterritorial space. I think that what is perhaps interesting and what goes beyond this witnessing, of which I'm kind of making some jokes about, was simply the changes in the public space. As a regular guy, so to speak, you knew little about what was going on behind at the top, essentially. because this political system was very hierarchical. But you could witness this enormous change of the public space. So, for instance, in a while you would read in the newspaper or in some journal an interview with someone who was released from a labor camp, and that person was released because it was his sentence was reversed. He was innocent, but he would say, "Well, now I've been 10 years in uranium mines, but that doesn't count to my pension plan. And in fact, I was underperforming, so I have to pay back because there was this they were paying for our living expenses, things like that." So gradually, I think the public space was changing, and that's probably for historians to kind of define in what ways, what were the causes, whether there is some kind of how could this happen despite everything? And that gives you some insight that the situation or some idea that the situation at that time was really not black and white anymore. So there were changes. How they came about and so on, I am not the right person to explain in detail. In January, so we were living in this happy enclave, which actually was not an enclave. It was, there were similar phenomena elsewhere. Nonetheless, let's call it the enclave at the university. Simone de Beauvoir visiting. Steinbeck came, for instance. Steinbeck had a speech. It was very strange because at that he just came from Vietnam, where he was hosted by the U.S. Army and flown in helicopters and given the occasion to shoot. He liked it, obviously. And we were living in this happy space. A Kafka conference, for instance, there was an event about Kafka. Kafka was interpreted in an interesting way. The official interpreters admitted that actually we could read Kafka in a socialist society because the socialist society has elements of alienation, and they are somehow expressed in Kafka and so on. So there were all these events. January 1968, a strange event happened. The leader, the boss of the Communist Party, was deposed. His name was Novotny, and Dubček, an alternative, was put in place instead of him. From this point on, this situation started to accelerate in many ways, and I'm most interested in this what you could see around, what you could talk about, what the emergence of, if in Paris there were 500 Hyde Park corners, in Prague there was at least one Hyde Park corner where you could talk about things that you would have been arrested before 2-3 years. Jokes, anecdotes. It sounds a little bit silly, but people would. This was a great era of anecdotes, and that's not only the point that they were great anecdotes. All these anecdotes, you would probably get 3 to 6 months in prison, 5 years before or something like that. So that's for me the force of the change. And all of a sudden, let's say if we kind of add months, you could, for instance, read in the newspaper that an article that talked about the KGB buildings in Prague. So there were photographs which were the residences of KGB in Prague that you didn't know before. That was not. In brief, I think the when Novotny exited, censorship was suspended, basically. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, and that's all about public space. Censorship was formally abandoned in June, I think, but it was not practiced. And there is then, what is special about this this period, I think, was that people had, at least at the beginning, some sense of self-censorship, what is possible to say. And it was possible to say, well, this man from the labor, from the Uranian mines had to pay back. So that was fine. But for quite a long time, it was not possible to, nobody would write anything about the Soviet Union, anything critical. But in these moments when you could look at these pictures of the KGB buildings in Prague, this began already to be very critical. And gradually, actually, there were very many openly critical articles, discussions, and so on about the Soviet Union, which I think was one of the essential kind of contributing moments in the decision of the Soviet Union to intervene by military means in August '68. I think that I could perhaps continue with a number of details, but as a witness, I cannot give you, I will not give you any serious political or historical analysis. The regime was obviously failing in many aspects, economically, and so on and so on. The reason why Novotny disappeared and his people was that there were reform communists, that there was an emerging reform communism. I think this is relatively well known, although perhaps we don't have deep insights. But I think that the interesting thing, for at least from my perspective, is this development of the public space, the changes of the public space, and at the same time, the fact that this all failed. And I think that it failed for many reasons, not only for the military invasion. I think that especially if you compare with Poland, there were several basic structural problems. And the main structural problem was that there were no alternatives, or that people were not yet thinking about any institutional alternatives to the Communist Party. The Communist Party was reforming itself. It produced even a reform program or very complicated document in the style they were used to write and think. And however, creating alternatives like Solidarność or something like that was, I would say, basically a taboo, or a lack of political experience, or maybe some from the audience will still come up with better terms. So the reasons, I think, that so in August 21st, the Soviet Union and the armies of the Warsaw Treaty invaded, and that was the preliminary end. The Prague Spring, as it was called then, lasted actually longer after the invasion than before, but that's a kind of a formal thing. I think that the failure of this whole enterprise consisted precisely in this, that there were no formal or no practical alternatives, that much of the reforms and changes was driven through the Communist Party. Had it maybe lasted for another 2-3 months, and I think the Soviets correctly recognized that there is a need to intervene, so the intervention on their part was quite logical and necessary. Although one could say that it was also a failure on their part, because the invasion was an ultimate step which revealed one simple fact, that they could not stage a coup d'etat, that previously they could not do some cleaning in the Politburo. So maybe there were failures at of many kinds, but had this process continued for another 2, 3, 4 months perhaps, it would be a radical change. It would probably result in free elections, in the emergence of political parties, which was at that time unthinkable. But it was kind of stopped at that time. So these are some, so sorry, this is not witnessing, this is already a political interpretation that I'm giving you. But I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you say this is one man's opinion, well, that's fine, it's one man's opinion. Thank you.
No, this will be fine. So thanks for the invitation, and thanks also for the film series. I don't know how many of you got to see it. I did, except for the film that I programmed, which I knew. I'd love to talk about it if we. It's cool, right? I'd love to talk about that if we have time, because the film. I don't know if this was intentional on your part or it came from the suggestions that we made, that we ended up with a film series from the 80s, and I think that's very, very interesting in the differences that it created. All right. So I'm neither a historian nor a witness. Being just a couple years older than the event that we're commemorating or remembering. And I come from German studies and from film studies. So I want to do 3 things, and if I run out of time, before I run out of time, if I don't do anything else, I want to show you a few film clips. So do give me a signal when you want me to stop if I'm not at the end. I want to think very briefly about periodization. Which I think is relevant across our case studies, but certainly in particular for Germany. I want to think about the national specificity of a transnational event, also very briefly. This is really just setting the stage. And then I want to think about a motif and see what you make of it that I discovered when we ran this German Film Institute on 1968 that has something to do with fire. So my question is, what difference does it make if we think of 1968 as a conflagration? And I have a few film clips that I want to show you in that regard. In the 1968 film Terror auch im Westen, Terror in the West too, the voiceover narrator asks, even before the titles flash on, when the Vietnam War began, and offers 3 dates. Did it begin in 1860? Did it begin in 1945? Or did it begin in 1965? Thereby raising the question of how to periodize the defining events of the 1960s in which the film is intervening, and in what histories and what temporalities to embed these events. And I think that's become only more relevant and important as we now have 50 years of a buffer between the events and us, which has added new layerings, new ways of building different layers of time around this, plenty of revisions and revisionism, plenty of time for the accretion of further temporalities, generational ones, geopolitical ones, and the temporalities of memory, to which I'll come at the end of my remarks. So just to throw out a few ways of thinking about 1968, obviously we have the year that we're using here, or maybe even the month that Josh used, the month of May, or specific events like the assassination of Martin Luther King, which was 50 years ago, just a week ago, the assassination attempt on one of the leaders of the movement in Germany, Rudi Dutschke, which tomorrow will have been 50 years ago, et cetera, right? We could just look those up kind of in a chronicle. We could also think, of course, about the 1960s. Is 68 kind of a representation or, in miniature of the 1960s, in which case the question is, how long is the decade? Is it from 1960 to 1970, or does it extend, into the beginning of the de Gaulle years, or the Eisenhower era, or the Adenauer era in Germany? And how far does it last? Does it last into the kind of through the march through the institutions of some of the movements, when they then start forming parties, like in Germany, the Green Party, which is only in 1979, which assembles a kind of coalition of feminist, ecological, and peace movement. The New Left basically becoming institutionalized. So that would be a very long 60s. Or would it be, as in Germany, the Red Decade, which runs in the dating of Gerd Koenen, whose book I draw on here, from June 2nd, 1967 to October 18th, 1977. June 2nd, 67 is the day on which the Shah visits Germany, and there's, and in the violence that follows, a young student named Benno Ohnesorg is shot by the police. And this is really a kind of starting point for the student movement in Germany. October 18th, 1977 is the day on which, after the Federal Republic has reclaimed has rescued the passengers in a Lufthansa jet that had been taken hostage in Mogadishu, and killed the terrorists. On that evening, the famous terrorists of the Baader-Meinhof gang, who were in prison in Stammheim, collectively committed suicide. And that kind of bookends a long decade of revolt, and in this case, violence. So that's a very different 68 again. And then I want to just draw your attention to the fact that if we're talking about Germany, it's kind of interesting and convenient that 1968 is almost precisely the midpoint between 1945, the end of World War II, and 1989, the end of the post-war, one version of the post-war era. In that sense, it becomes a kind of specific hinge in Germany that I think is somewhat different than in the other countries we're looking at. And although I think we have to talk about the transnationalism of the movement, I think we also need to think about the specificities. So, especially in the context of a Center for European Studies. I do want to say something about those specificities, but frame them obviously with a gesture toward what Josh also gestured toward, the kind of decolonization, imperialism as a really global context. I'm not a historian researching this, but my sense is that the global 60s are certainly the object of a lot of research and publication these days, and dissertations being written right here at Michigan. And one needs to bear in mind that whatever happens in 68 in Paris or in Berlin or in Prague has global contexts, the most obvious one of which would likely be Vietnam. And here's my first film clip, which, I don't know, can you read it? It says, "Was unterscheidet West-Berlin von Vietnam?" What distinguishes West Berlin from Vietnam is the question asked in this film from 1968 by Harun Farocki, who I'll come back to. And this is the montage that ensues.
Ist himmelhoch. Der Stand ihrer technischen Entwicklung ist himmelhoch.
These are German newspapers that are falling, sorry.
Wie schützen wir uns?
Was können
How shall we protect ourselves was the question at the end. So it's a somewhat heavy-handed montage of German newspapers from the Springerpresse, which is the kind of the Hearst publishing empire of Germany, which was the main target of the students for big stretches of the 60s, with bombs falling on Vietnam. And basically the argument, the unescapable argument is West Berlin is Vietnam, and nothing distinguishes West Berlin from Vietnam. So that's a telescoping of global context into a national one that I think one needs to be very mindful of. At the same time, I think Germany, again, is quite specific, and that has to do, of course, with its history. This is one of my favorite slogans from the era, which would translate roughly, this is from '67, people unfurling a banner in a strategy that we've seen again in recent years. Under the robes, the stench of 1,000 years. That's my second favorite slogan. My favorite one is from the same year when the women organized in the German SDS under the slogan, befreit die sozialistischen Eminenzen von ihren bürgerlichen Schwänzen, which means liberate the socialist luminaries from their bourgeois dicks. This one, unlike that one, this one makes reference explicitly to the Thousand-Year Reich, right? So the argument is that again, the main institution being the universities in this case, what needs to be confronted, first of all, is the legacy of fascism, which is something that I think it makes the case in Germany quite specific. 1968 is very clearly a revolt against the generation of the fascists. That's been revised in lots of ways, but I think it was part of the self-understanding at the time, to the point where Hannah Arendt wrote in a letter to the publicist and author Hans Magnus Enzensberger that the Germans were sort of reveling in what she called a felix culpa, a happy guilt. And that this actually had become a sort of negative moral capital that the young Germans were drawing on as a way of staging their revolt. This is now part of a somewhat revisionist account of 1968, but I think it's quite interesting that Hannah Arendt was putting her finger on this in 1968. This is from the era that she's saying, you're using your guilt in order to stage your revolt as somehow different and better than that of others. At the same time, that produces in Germany, to anybody who does German studies knows this, some very muddled relationships between perpetrators and victims, and I'll come back to that at the very end. So with those preliminaries, really, here just one more from the film that was shown on Sunday from Marianne and Juliane. I've always been struck by the fact that the film makes reference to Alain René's Night and Fog, the famous film about the concentration camps, which is screened in the film by the father of the terrorists, who's a pastor and belongs to the Nazi generation. And then when they're grown up, they watch another film, and it's staged exactly in the same way, and it's about Vietnam. So suddenly Vietnam takes the place in the image, literally, of Auschwitz, which that's what I mean by the layering of perpetration and guilt and victimhood becoming somewhat muddled. Okay, with those preliminaries out of the way, just one really more experimental thought, and that is, what happens if we think of 1968 in terms of conflagration? This goes back to that seminar that we did 10 years ago now, which is shocking to me, where we showed a number of films from around 1968, and I noticed that a lot of them played with fire in lots of different ways. And I started thinking about what the centrality of the motif of fire in the way we represent to ourselves 1968, and in the way 1968 presented itself in its media, what that might mean and how it might be useful to think about that, and also what the limitations are in thinking about that. And I'm not going to go through that in detail. I'm just going to kind of touch on a few images and then see if you would like to follow my invitation to start thinking this way. This is an image from the reconstruction of a film that circulated in 1967 called How to Make a Molotov Cocktail, which was screened at the Springer Tribunal, which was the student congress against this Hearst publishing company. I'm using that as a shorthand for the German Springer, which got taken up quite literally a few months later, and I'll get to that in a minute. But of course, the motif of fire, which is linked to arson, Molotov cocktails, throwing them into department stores and warehouses and into the press and lighting press buses on fire, is linked in certain ways to other appearances of the fire motif, whether it is in Vietnam and the development of napalm, 100 miles north of here at Dow Chemical, or whether it's linked to, or then picked up later in the self-immolation of Jan Palach later in 1968, I think it's 1969 in January or February in Prague. So in that sense, this is not specific to Germany, but again, it's worth pausing on the specificity of the German connotations. You'll remember, if you saw the film, that Marianne and Juliane ends with the image of the young boy who's the son of the terrorist left to her sister, who's more the reformist. He has been deeply traumatized. By an attack on him as the son of a terrorist, and the form that this takes in the film is of a burning body, certainly reminiscent of the images that are being transported in the 60s. This film is from 1981, from Vietnam. This play with fire is part of the self-stylization of the left at the time. And this is a particularly telling and I think shocking moment where the Kommune 1, the famous group of young people living together in a commune, they were made famous, among other things, by the equivalent of German's Time magazine putting a picture of them naked on the cover. In the wake of a fatal fire at a Brussels department store in 1967, the Communards satirically described the calamity as an advertising gag, celebrating it for its didactic value. Our Belgian friends, I'm translating from here, from the pamphlet that they circulated. Our Belgian friends, they claim, finally figured out how to have the people truly participate in the fun and games in Vietnam. They set fire to a department store, 300 saturated bourgeois conclude their exciting lives, and Brussels becomes Hanoi. End of quote. At the heart of the anti-American satire lie notions of participation and empathy, which are two political values central to the New Left, but articulated here, ironically, as, quote, this crackling Vietnam feeling, being there and burning along with everyone else, and I'm still quoting, which we have yet to experience here in Berlin. So now they want Berlin to look like Vietnam through this connecting motif of fire, and the passage ends with, I think I don't have the full text here, ends with burn, warehouse, burn. This gets taken up in the movement itself. There's arson, and like I said, the attack on Springer, and then it gets taken up in a lot of films of the movement. And I'm out of time, so I can't show them all to you. But I want to identify two sensibilities. One is the kind of party-like, I forget what you said, Josh. You said the fairground or something like that. Carnivalesque, right? So there's a set of films from Munich where this is kind of playing with fire, and it's always playful. Rote Sonne is one of them. Nicht fummeln, Liebling, for which I have no translation, is one of them. And Brandstifter, Arsonist, is very literal in the way it takes on the arson that was committed by the terrorists to be in 1968. It also becomes the object of biting irony, as in the short film by Harun Farokhi called White Christmas, which to Bing Crosby crooning shows us people burning and bombs falling. And then in arguably one of the most emblematic moments of at least Farokhi's career, this is called Nicht löschbares Feuer. I'd love to show it, but I'm out of time again because I do want to show you one other clip. He illustrates and explains how napalm works by putting out a cigarette on his arm and saying that's a tenth of the heat that napalm develops. So very didactic, Brechtian, breaking the fourth wall. This is what you need to understand. Sorry. But to end with the memory culture of this, so those are images of the media event, the media revolt, saying we have to open people's eyes in the media, and we're going to shock you with this motif of fire. Then it gets pacified in ways that I think you were pointing to as well. And so around 2001, we get a film called What to Do in Case of Fire, which I'm going to not get into here, but it's referencing very clearly the Molotov cocktail film that I mentioned. And then the Baader-Meinhof complex, where we get what I call a conflagration conflation. Now we have blockbuster cinema restaging the events of 1968. All the leading actors in Germany, the big blockbuster director, Bernd Eichinger, I think this might have been his last film that he made. And we meet Ulrike Meinhof, still a journalist. She'll become one of the terrorists in 1968 in April, on the eve of Rudi Dutschke's assassination attempt. When everybody goes to attack that newspaper building, you see the vans burning. It's all documentary, but then the filmmakers invent this one figure that I've clipped for you here, and I'll end on this clip. I'll say 2 words and then stop. So this is Ulrike Meinhof. Not really. Dresden, Hiroshima, Vietnam, and a guy standing like this, Christ-like, as a victim, celebrating his victim status, right? And conflating different kind of moments of conflagration that would have been impossible, that would have been anathema in 1968 to bring up Dresden. Absolutely impossible, the firebombing of Dresden by the British troops. In 2008, when this film was made, it's part of a big discourse around how do we come to terms with the past, and shouldn't we also pay attention to the fact that Germans were victimized along with Jews in World War II. And so this film has nothing better to do than to conflate these things into one spectacular image of fire, and that's where I'll end. Thanks.
So we'll invite everyone here. We have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Ginger? I think you have to turn it on. As a witness? So I think there's interesting themes here that that you brought up about periodization and how, you know, looking back at 68 from the 1980s perspective and 2008 and now with the Me Too, Black Lives Matter 2018 is one issue that we might want to discuss. Another one is how the student protests get controlled, co-opted, or repressed by the state or other agencies. So, I mean, in Prague, you have the Warsaw Pact that invades Czechoslovakia. In Poland is the party that transforms basically the student protest movement as one in a narrative of intra-party fight for power, and it turns into an anti-Semitic purge with 20,000 Jews being kicked out of Poland. In France, de Gaulle re-emerges victorious. So that's another thing that we might want to think about, and think about how now protests might be also, you know, more or less successful depending on how they are reacted, not against, but with or on. I don't know how we want to put this. So I don't know if you want to comment on each other's presentations first, or if we should just open it. Okay, I'll open it, and I think the best way to do it is to gesture to me. Okay, Scott Spector in the back, and then I'll start making a list, and if you don't mind saying your name.
Scott Spector.
And then, thank you, Scott.
So, no, it was...
And then keep your comments kind of brief.
As short as possible. Yes, it was really just to back up what Geneviève said, just because I thought both of your questions also came to my mind. And I thought in particular to ask the panelists to if they could say more in terms of reflecting on the present, in terms of the commonality in the three talks about the 68 moment as a moment of kind of reflection on the victory over fascism at the end of World War II, and that moment of hope or promise that gets kind of reinstantiated in 68 in different ways in the different places, and then the ways in which, for instance, in Antifa and other movements now, there is a way of thinking about a kind of the struggle against fascism, for instance, as something ongoing, incomplete, an unfinished project, and so forth. I mean, it's quite different in the Czechoslovak case, where it's a top-down, at least, you know, it's a Czechoslovak communist project in part, or it's directed in that way, but I just wondered about this kind of eternal return that came up right in Josh's talk, and that then continued throughout the three talks.
Is there another question for now? I can gather a couple, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. Yes? Okay.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Carter. Thank you for these talks. I have one small question about Germany, which just stems from, I don't know about this. Why were they targeting the newspaper publisher? I was just curious about that. But then my larger question is sort of about the understanding of revolution. So what would you say 1968 did to our understandings of what a revolution is? Like Josh, you talked about a social revolution and sort of this idea of individual emancipation. So I'd be curious what you all think about that.
Thank you.
I'll say a couple things. Is that okay? So let's take fascism first, and I'll speak briefly about revolution. Or maybe I'll let you do that one. So in Germany, the archetypal story of 68, a kid who's at the university in 1968 in Berlin was born probably in 1942, right, or 44 or 46, right, that, and grew up in a household that didn't want to talk about the war years. In France, it's different because de Gaulle actually is the leader of the resistance against fascism. And so there's a curious reversal that takes place in 1968 as it's played out against the background of French history, and or a kind of transference. It's the French state's behavior during the wars of decolonization that prove that France is no better than the fascists, the use of torture in the Algerian War. And de Gaulle is the representative of the state that unleashes the power of the military, unleashes the power of the police against citizens demonstrating in the streets. And that's very recent. It's in the late 50s and in the early 1960s. And part of what the kids in France are doing is appropriating the idea of true resistance from de Gaulle himself, the resistor, right? De Gaulle was the leader of the resistance, and they remake a resistance myth against de Gaulle, against de Gaulle himself. Revolution. So, really quickly, in the late 1940s, 1/3 of the voting electorate voted for the Communist Party. That is a party that defined revolution in terms of class conflict, in terms of social classes in constant struggle. And in large part, the Communist Party maintained that definition of revolution through 1968. But the critique of capitalism that emerges in this sort of broader intellectual ferment is one that's about the failure of that message, right? It's about what do you do when capitalism doesn't collapse in social revolution? What do you do when capitalism proves itself to be resilient and people are happy buying Vespas and answering advertisements with beautiful people in them, right? And it's that. I mean, that's what people, I think, are referring to when they say that 68 is the last social revolution. It's the last one that defines itself as a kind of society protecting itself from political forces that make it impossible for people to relate to one another in a human way, right? The economy gets in the way, politics gets in the way. Yeah.
Well, I think oh, sorry. Okay. I think there are interesting points here on all sides. I would say there are also important differences, and in some sense I'm wondering why we are sitting all at these tables, because it's just 68. But the reasons for these events, especially in Prague and versus, let's say, Paris or Germany, were very different. And that leads and has led and led already at that time to great misunderstandings. And that also led to the myth of 68, that this was a kind of a global bubbling all over and everyone was right in some sense. But I would say, again, I'm not a historian, but so from what I remember, the basic difference was that, or let's put it that way, people in Prague had no understanding or simply did not understand what's going on in Paris. That was simply on the point of the ridiculous. What do they want? We want exactly the opposite. We want to live in what's the word? Not luxury, but we want to live in some kind of a functioning society. Let's put it that way. One of the big differences, what shocked people in Prague actually were the scenes of violence. There was no comparable violence of this type, street violence, shop windows, or of this type of what we have seen. Prague saw this type of violence many years later. I think in 1996, when the Monetary Fund had a meeting in Prague, and Prague became a rally point for all sorts of anarchist groups from all Europe. And there was a lot of smashed windows at that point, but that was not the style. Also, I think that and that perhaps ties in, Prague was not a student revolt, simply. Students played, of course, a very important role in this, and had there been more time and so on, it would have shown better. But what happened in Czechoslovakia at that time was, I would say, just a cliche. It was broadly based. It was something that these Hyde Park corners, they were not run by students. They were not run by intellectuals. This was a kind of a grassroots reaction coming from all kind of walks of life. So I would say three differences, perhaps, and it was not, in that sense, it was also not a revolution. So if you are looking, I have here some linguistic objections. You know, you have many choices of calling a violent event something. Some call it a revolution, some call it a counter-revolution, some call it maybe a putsch or something like that. So this we could discuss for a long time. I'm not sure we would reach some clear conclusion. It's a flexible term, but I would say the big difference in vis-a-vis the rest, the Czech movement or Czechoslovak movement was much more self-contained, which was its problem, I would say. It was not a revolution. It was not violent, and students played a big role, definitely, especially in Prague. But in fact, I remember distributing some leaflets or something like that. And but it was a broadly based event that had kind of a center in Prague, of course, but dozens and dozens and dozens of centers elsewhere. So that's so this kind of delimitation, if you want, is necessary, I think, because there, in my opinion, there were many misunderstandings about that, and there is this. There should be no myth of 68, I think.
But I mean, I think it's an important point. I'll turn to Johannes, but it's also interesting that you had around the late 60s protest movements in North America, Latin America, Asia, you know, that have to do with decolonization, etc., and that they're expressed in similar fashions in many places. So without wanting to fall into mythology and magic thinking, those groups were also often borrowing tactics and language from each other. So I think it's important to both see like the differences between and the different objectives, very different objectives that they had, the different contexts in which they were happening, but also the kind of cross-fertilization in them. Johannes?
I would agree, and I think you have to remember the fact that the word at the time was revolution. So we can be historically critical of it and linguistically critical of it, but it was certainly used in an inflationary way. I mean, it was all over. Every change in habit that you made was a revolution, and it was embedded in large scale theories of revolution. Just very briefly, I think that why the Springerpresse, why the newspapers, I think because the students in Berlin in particular felt that this publishing house had a stranglehold on on the news. It was a similar critique to the one that was recently launched of Sinclair for making everybody say the same thing. Because they owned the Bild Zeitung, which is the biggest newspaper in Germany still, I think, and the Berliner Morgenpost, and they owned a lot of papers, and all of which were towing the same line. And there was no counter-public sphere, which is what the media revolt was about, creating a counter-public sphere. And I can't really add much to the debate on either fascism or revolution. I would note that, I think to describe what happened in Germany as a revolution would be wrong, in part because Germany worked very hard to make that impossible in the way it formulated its basic law in 1949, West Germany, and the way it reformulated it in 1968 in response to the growing student movement. They enacted, for the first time since the Weimar Republic, emergency laws that passed. So it was score one for the counter-revolution, basically. And that, not that particular event, but the combination of events drove some of the revolutionaries into violent resistance, which then became the long German autumn of terrorism, so the Red Decade that I talked about. The place of fascism, I talked a little bit about how that's specific in Germany. I think, Scott, your question about how do we think about it today is really relevant. It's worth remembering that it was 1968 that put fascism on the table as a word that you used liberally against all sorts of totalitarianism. That then became very debated, heavily debated in the 1980s, to the point of a lot of people like me thinking, okay, we need to be much more careful about the way we use the term fascist. And now I'm feeling I should be less careful again, maybe. The only other thing I'd throw in here is Habermas, who I do think, I know some people think he's much too gradualist and a reformer, not revolutionary at all, but he had a lot of good things to say, and in his analysis, the social philosopher of coming out of Frankfurt. One of them was from 1968, immediately responding to the violent response among the student movement, justifiably violent, to the assassination of this young student, Benno Ohnesorg, by saying that some of the tactics they were espousing was what he would call left-wing fascism. And now that's a very, very incendiary term to use in 1968. And he was heavily critiqued for it. And I think it's worth going back and looking at the exact context in which he said it, because his argument is there are ways of enacting revolt and creating Hyde Park corners and whatever else we want that are totalitarian and that shut down difference. And he was reacting to that. So that's just another context for the debate about where the anti-fascist movement goes from 1968 on. But it clearly is the moment at which the taboo on speaking about fascism is broken, and that Habermas too saw as fundamental to the development of the Federal Republic.
Yeah. Any questions? More?
Yeah. Teresa Kovac. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I come back to Scott's question as well, because we experience now that right-wing movements, current right-wing movements, use 1968 as well and say we are doing the protest again. And so, for example, in Austria, we had the Identitäre, and they tried to occupy a theater in Vienna and the university, and they said we do exactly the same, what happened in 1968, and all of a sudden you don't like what they did back then. And so I would love to hear more what you think of this right-wing side of this protests.
Yeah. Maybe I could address that really briefly two ways. First, on the transnational thing, we have to remember that all of these places where unrest takes place in the 1960s, whether it's Berkeley, Ann Arbor, Mexico City, or Berlin, or Paris, or Madagascar, where students were also like Montreal, right? I lived in Madison, Wisconsin as a kid growing up. So, so all those places have local circumstances, but what makes those places feel connected to the participants at the time is the Cold War, right? That the Cold War made transnational confrontations seem linked, right? American army is in Germany. The American army is in Vietnam. The American state is propping up regimes in Central America, right? Dow Chemical is recruiting people to come, engineers to come work for them in Madison, Wisconsin, and that's how kids in Madison get politicized, because Dow Chemical is also dropping napalm on Vietnam, right? So it's the Cold War that creates the impression that everybody's local struggle is part of a global struggle, even though the circumstances, the historical resonances, all played themselves out very differently in each case. In the United States, it was against the background of the Civil Rights Movement, which had taken place earlier in the 60s, right? In Germany, it's fascism. In France, it's decolonization. But it's the Cold War which makes everybody feel, right? And even for Prague, actually, right? That makes them feel connected, as if they might be part of the same struggle. So populisms of the right and the left, right? And connections between the sort of the dangerous situation that we find ourselves in today. The revolutionary movements of the 1960s failed in many ways to prevent the creation of an international economic order that made the world safe for capital to move rapidly around from country to country while people couldn't, right? And we're seeing the results of the failures of that model for an international economy, right? And even at a European level, the failures of the Eurozone, the failures of European integration to create a model in which wealthier countries like Germany and France are willing to pay to support the economic development of countries in Southern Europe, like Greece, right, have created a kind of political backlash against those models of integration. And in Europe and also in the United States, that backlash has fed a kind of populism on the right. There are people who say right now that what we need in response is a populism of the left. I'm not so sure that I mean, I don't make predictions. I only look at the past. You know, it's clear that the angers that were expressed, however inarticulately, in 1968 have corresponding levels today. If you look at somebody like Scott Pruitt at the EPA, right, he is, you know, he sees himself as dismantling the bureaucracy. But those kids in 1968 who were challenging the university also had posters that says, non à la bureaucratie. They were challenging a system of state management that they saw that was being imposed. So that vocabulary is not limited to the right or the left. It's available for people to express their discontent.
And the aesthetics, I think that's an important point too, that actually even the right borrows from left-wing aesthetics from that time as a way to legitimize themselves and confuse people. And the left sometimes uses also the aesthetics of the right. So when you were talking about the protest against the World Trade Organization, people with black masks, etc. So the boundaries are becoming blurred between the left and the right in protest movements in ways that's sometimes problematic.
Well, I think that if you think about it, there are very few options, and that generates the similarities. The options are the street. What's happening in the street, that's a very important kind of factor, and that's, however, a space of performance. That's not always a space of that's a space where you have bodies, not always thoughts. So simply I want to say there are similarities might be superficial in some sense, because there are, after all, not so many options, especially in urban societies. So what do? You go to the main square, or you go to the next big park or something like that. So
I don't think that's true. I think you go to the internet. I mean, I've been taking an interest in the way the alt-right creates itself on the internet, and I'm sure I know I'm not the only one. And the observation there is exactly the same. It's that a kind of a culture of outrage, fun, irony, laughter has migrated from the early days of the internet severely to the right, where it's now almost owned by the right, and that the ability to stage avant-garde interventions, whether in the street, in the public square, or on the internet, is severely constrained. And it feels like outrage belongs now to the right. And that's a bad affective situation for us to find ourselves in.
On this cheery note, I'd like to thank the speakers, right? And I invite everyone to join us for a reception. Thank you.
Thank you.